Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome once again to the Power of Reading, a book review program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice, and we continue our journey in this program where we enter into the world of books. We review them and we try to grow in our faith and in our knowledge through books. And in this program, we endeavor to continue to introduce to you the important classical and latest Catholic books. And also in this program, we want to promote the culture of reading because we believe that reading has good and lasting effects on our faith as Christians and also in our everyday life. Of course, reading has great challenges in our modern day because of our modern communication technology, which actually has replaced some of our habits of acquiring knowledge, of entertaining ourselves, and somehow we have sidelined the written word, the book, and actually some of us actually have lost completely the taste of reading, but we realize that reading has good and lasting effects, and there is a way we learn through reading that we cannot achieve through the internet or through the social media. The book is still one of the best inventions in human history, and of course, in the development of the human person. Now, we continue with our program today as we continue to serialize the book that we have been reviewing. Actually, we are not only reviewing it and saying what it is about, but we are trying to serialize this book because it is a history of the Catholic Church. A History of the Catholic Church is a volume that talks about more than 2,000 years of the life of the church, the life of our faith, the life of the Christians. And this book is written by Father Norbert Bruckmann and Father Umberto Pescantini, and it was also revised by Father Stephen Jure, and it is a publication of Pauline's Publications Africa. And actually, we have made a great journey with this book, which has 18 chapters, and right now we are in chapter 8, where we continue to look at this book. And today, actually, we shall not repeat again the table of contents. We have done that for the last 4 programs, and I'm sure at least we have an idea. And it's also our hope that most of us have been able to acquire this book so that we can make this journey together. So today we shall be starting another experience. Remember that what we have done now from chapter 1 to about chapter 8, of course, we dealt with the time of Jesus. We talked about the time of the apostles. Then we came to the time of the fathers of the church, people like St. Augustine, St. Athanasius. We also spoke about the different churches and where they were located. Of course, we had the church in North Africa, in Alexandria, in Carthage. We also had the church in the eastern part of Europe, that is in Constantinople. We had also the church in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, and of course in Rome. So these are also what they call the patriarchates, which were very, very important in the early life of the church. Other things that we have discussed in reviewing this book, A History of the Catholic Church, is also in connection to what we call the monastic life, the life that Christians after the time of persecution started living. A monastic life, especially this life, was started by St. Anthony of Egypt, who went into the desert, the life of sacrifice, of penance, and in imitation to Christ, who before his public ministry went into the desert to pray and to be tempted by the devil, somehow echoing what the Israelites had experienced on their way from Egypt to the promised land, and they spent 40 years in the desert. So we also see that kind of life, which actually started in North Africa, was relatively unknown in Europe, and this was made popular by St. Athanasius, who actually wrote the history or the story or the biography of St. Anthony of the Desert, and this inspired actually the people who were able to revive Christianity, the monks who were able to revive Christianity in Europe after the decline of the Roman Empire. So we have been through this great experience. Now, of course, I have just mentioned about the decline of the Roman Empire, and actually this is where we go in our reflections today, in our sharing today, because we know that the last part of the Middle Ages start from about the 6th to the 10th century. We see a period of decline. The church entered in a period of decline. Remember, also there were other things that contributed to this. One of them was the decline of the Roman Empire, and the church had created its way of governance following how the Roman Empire was organized. Now, when it declined, that meant certain centers declined. There was a bit more insecurity. Remember, there were those beautiful roads built by the Romans to foster trade and communication and interaction. So that also made it difficult for the Christians to move from place to place and be able to bring the good news. Of course, also that meant that there were other invasions. Other people came up who wanted to conquer this declining empire. We also have the invasion of the barbarians, the Germanic tribes from the eastern part of Europe around Germany, coming towards the Mediterranean, where we saw the church had flourished, and also that had its own effects in the church. But after some time, there were also pockets of Christianity that remained. So Christianity was under attack in different ways. Of course, initially there was the persecutions. Then we had these barbarian invasions. Soon after the barbarian invasions, we also had the rise of Islam, and also the idea that they were sent to conquer the whole world and things like that. So Christianity declined, especially even in North Africa. You find places like Carthage, that is the area of the Maghreb, that today is no longer Christian because the Muslims were able to easily conquer. And that was what we used to call the Latin part of the Roman Empire. So those are the experiences that these people had. So because of this decline of this beautiful actually the Roman Empire was also a bit mixed with the Greek culture, the Hellenistic culture. So the historians talk about the Greco-Roman culture, which was very rich in terms of governance, in terms of organization, in terms of also education. There was the Greek philosophy. So this went into decline, and also that affected the church in one way or the other. And at the Middle Ages, we find that the life of the church changed. It was also affected to the way of governance. The big empires fell, and there was what we call the feudal system, whereby the poorest remained on the lowest level, which also included the Christians and the priests, and also that had effect even in the doctrine, we can say, progress of the church. So all these things happened. And now today we shall look at what happens at what we call the last part of the Middle Ages, because also there was a time that there was a revival. There was an awakening. Something was happening. Of course, there was alienation. We find a church like Ethiopia was completely cut off because there was a block of an Islamic territory, which was also very huge, and things like that. And also the church learned some lessons. For example, the Islamic faith was able to grow among what we call the Berbers and the Arabs, who were nomads moving from place to place, who were actually hardly touched by what we call the Latin culture or the Roman Greco culture. The Greek and Roman culture did not touch them. So it was not easy for the church to defend them because they had not experienced this new faith. They had not been evangelized. And that is also some of the lessons that the church learned. And they had their own faiths. They believed in many idols which were based in Mecca and all that. And eventually when Muhammad, the prophet, received the revelation from Allah, then it was very easy for him to be able to bring these people together because they found a purpose, a meaning. And we know that also Islam has a few similarities, some similarities with Judaism, but also with Christianity. For example, they accept Jesus as a prophet. They don't accept him as divine. And many other things. They accept Abraham. They believe in one God. They believe in circumcision as the Jews were. So there are a lot of similarities. So there was some type of knowledge of these religions at the beginning, also for the Islamic religion. But also we know that we have a long history of conflict between Christianity and Islam. And it's very difficult for us as we continue our interreligious dialogue to understand where we can step together. But when we learn a history like this that we are reviewing today, it helps us to have a better perspective. So we are going to take our first break as we come and see what happens and towards the end of the Middle Ages and how the church tries to reorganize itself. So we take our first break here at Radio Maria Nairobi as we continue with our program, The Power of Reading. You are listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and today we continue the long journey we have been making with the book A History of the Catholic Church, and this book actually explains to us the journey that the church made, the Christian people, but also gives us a lot of information about what was happening even in the secular world. And most of these things also affected the life of the Christians, the life of the people. And this book is written by Father Norbert Bruckmann and Father Umberto Pescantini. Now, in the last part of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church entered a period of decline. There continued to be holy men and women, reformers and prominent churchmen who helped to make the church continue living, but that glory of the Catholic Church had gone. We are talking about the 9th, 10th, 11th century. There was corruption, there was schism, there was dissension, and these things, they were difficult to correct. Now, let us see what our authors tell us about the Byzantines. The Byzantines, that is in the East, the Byzantine church at the Middle Ages was badly battered. It was badly ruined, but held firm for 700 years. And it turned away from its interests in the West. Now we are talking about Constantinople, that territory that also was not conquered by the Roman Empire. And we see that all energies were directed at its own deliverance from the Muslim threat. And the main battleground was Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, which actually was the Byzantine heartland. And as the Eastern Empire lost its control over Palestine, Syria, and other territories, it concentrated its defense on Constantinople and the Balkan dominions. And in 1453, however, Constantinople fell and the Byzantines came under the Islamic domination. So Byzantine Christianity suffered a lot, but at the same time, they were able, because they really wanted to hold on Constantinople. Constantinople was one of the patriarchates. So they had tried to keep their faith, but still they were able to keep part of their faith in the far, far east, and they were able to expand beyond Turkey by active missionary work. And of course, monasticism spread out of Egypt and Palestine. And in the Byzantine church, it was taken up by the great theologian St. Basil. Basil, a man of practical mind, accepted the spirit of the desert monks, but not their form of life. St. Basil was a genius. Actually, what he did, he accepted, remember the monastic life was born in Egypt, but it was very, very austere. The Copts there were used to very hard life, a desert life. Remember, when they went to the desert, they left the Nile Valley and went to a very rough situation. So Basil took some of the aspects of this monastic life, and he said the way they would live their own, what they call the Basilian monastery, that each monastery should have an active work of charity, either an orphanage, a school, or a mission. And it was therefore natural for those who are followers or the missionaries of St. Basil to be able to follow. And actually, when they went out and founded these monasteries, they were able to evangelize what we call the Slavic people. And this was very, very important. We see that also, Basil was with other people, as our authors here tell us. There was Cyril and Methodius, who also began their great missionary enterprise in what we call the Balkans, soon coming into contact with Latin missionaries from the West, and gradually a line between the two expressions of Christianity was drawn in Eastern Poland, through Hungary, and across Yugoslavia. And this is where you find now the birth of what we call the Latin Catholic Church. That is a church somehow connected to Rome, and also the Orthodox Church, which actually right now we are in communion, but there are certain things that we do differently, but they do not affect the faith, they do not affect the doctrine. And that's why even when you have canon law, there is canon law for the Latin Church, there is canon law for the Eastern Orthodox churches. They are called Eastern Orthodox churches. Sometimes even when you see their bishops, they are dressed slightly different from our bishops. So this is how this situation arose. It was actually quite historical, and that's why you see Eastern Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia. They have a different way of expressing certain things. For example, they love using a lot of incense and things like that. We know that their priests still get married, most of them, not all, but most of them. We have all that. And we see that at this time, of course, it was not a smooth discussion that they were having. There were a few tensions here and there between what we call the Byzantine and the Latin Christians, and also some competition. But generally, uneasiness, truce prevailed. The Pope tried to support mutual respect, defending, for example, Cyril and Methodius from those who criticized them from the East. But the missionaries who are in the frontier, who would meet in everyday situations, did not always pay attention to what the popes were saying. And we are even told sometimes several patriarchs of Constantinople were at odds at times. And by 865, the Bulgarians were being brought into Byzantine Christianity by Boris, their king, who used the new faith to break the power of the nobles and help create a centralized nation. So also the political rulers tried to use these situations also for their own advantages, even though somebody like this king, Boris of the Bulgarians, eventually retired into a monastery and gave the throne over to one of his sons, who was called Simeon, who was actually a monk. So these are things that we find. But Boris, this man, introduced the Slavonic language as the liturgical language instead of Greek, thus effectively creating a national church affiliated with Constantinople. And Boris and Simeon saw to it that all the bishops were Bulgarians. And this is just to help us to understand how the Byzantine life was, and there was this kind of close connection among them. There was submission to the power of the kings. And if you look at Russia, the important figure was the Christian Queen Olga, and she tried to obtain a Latin bishop for Kiev, the capital, but this mission failed, and she kept Christianity alive with a number of people during the violent rule of her son, a pagan warrior. And Olga's grandsons fought for the succession, and Prince Landamir won, killing his own brother. So you see, this is the kind of history that they went through, even in the Byzantine church. And of course, they also had the challenge of Islam. And of course, there was also a heresy that challenged the Byzantine church, the Eastern church, for many years. That is called iconoclasm. Icons are distinctive form of Eastern religious art representing Christ, Mary, the saints, or even the Trinity. And many Orthodox homes have one, and they always adorn the wall, which separates the sanctuary from the people in Byzantine churches. And Eastern churches do not use statues and rarely keep the Eucharist in the tabernacle. So there were these challenges between Byzantine and the Eastern understanding of the faith. And that's why you find that there are quite a number of different expressions in Eastern Europe in terms of Christianity. However, it's good to note, as our authors here tell us, that beneath the religious questions also lay political issues. And the emperors always wanted to conquer the patriarchs, the bishops, even the monks. And one of the things that was frustrating to them is that monks were not easily influenced because they refused to have the ranks and other things. They had this idea of a life of sacrifice. And in the end, the monks somehow represented a church free of state control. And of course, this meant that they were highly, highly persecuted. And there were many popes like Pope Gregory II who supported the monks. And there were many situations that happened. Some were not even beautiful to think about. There was even counter-reactions, even from the popes themselves. And this is part of what led to what we call the Great Schism that happened in 1054. And this is a disgraceful event because this brought the whole situation into a crisis, because there had been a trading of insults and other things between the church leaders. And in the end, the Pope closed the Latin churches and monasteries in Constantinople. And this, of course, brought the Great Schism because there was this different expression or understanding of how to express the life of the church. Of course, there are details here that you can read for yourself, dear listener, of what happened and that lack of dialogue that took place, the challenges the church was going through, and the final results of these divisions, political and religious, was separation, and rivalries were multiplied. And even during the common effort against Islam, the two cultures even had time to attack each other. So there was that break between the Western and the Eastern church. That's why we talk about the last tin as being the Western. It means just being in the Western part of Christianity and the Eastern part of Christianity. There was a break. And it is in 1054 that the schism was complete, because actually what happened is that both popes and patriarchs excommunicated each other. And attempts that were made to heal the breach failed. That's why we ended up with the Byzantine and Catholic churches having issues. But even with this, the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Church recognize or accept each other's sacraments, and also they recognize that they have a common priesthood. And of course, we know that there have been efforts of reunion, like in 1964, Pope Paul VI and the Patriarch Athenagoras removed the excommunications and they made a common pilgrimage to Holy Land. But this, what we call the Greek Schism, was a big blow to Christian unity. And this, of course, has affected the life of the church for a long time, but at the same time, it has also helped it to define itself and to understand itself. And actually, what our authors do, they also dedicate a sub-chapter to the Great Schism, because this Great Schism also brought other realities, not just the challenges that were there between the East and the Western church. So this is also something that is worth reading, and to understand how each area of the church tried to understand this reality. And of course, there was also a lot of difficulty after this schism with what we call the conciliarism. And this is having a church that do not accept fully the authority of the Pope. So the papacy, not the Pope as himself, but as an office, went through a lot of challenges. And also, not only that, because the Pope is not there to maybe just command, do this, do that, but this is what we call the teaching authority. So that teaching authority was also damaged, what we call the collegial teaching authority of the bishop. So there was also this kind of situation where there was conciliarism that created that doubt. So if the popes cannot keep unity within the church, can they be trusted and things like that? And of course, we see that also after there was the renewal that we find within the church that is very, very important. There was a new way of looking at life. Of course, at this time, because the papacy had lost its glory, we find also this is the time that you hear about the popes who did not really live beautiful lives, or what we would call lives of virtue. Or sometimes we are told about popes who are married, or sometimes there were more than one pope. These were the situations. Even the authority of the Pope himself was undermined. And because of this, sometimes people who are chosen into these responsibilities, say that bishops or the Pope, would have many other interests. And of course, that wounded the church and left that, we could say, a dark history in the journey of the church. And as our authors always remind us, there was always somebody raised by God to put the church back into the right track. And we shall see what happens. And this is actually what eventually led to what we call the Reformation, reactions like Martin Luther had, because there were abuses, there was lack of focus, there was total misunderstanding of what is happening. The center was not holding. So we are going to take a break as we continue to look at chapter 9, where we talk about not only the schism that we saw between the Eastern and the Western church, but also what the historians tell us as the division of Christianity. This is the Power of Reading program, and today we continue reviewing and serializing the book, A History of the Catholic Church. So we take a break as we continue to see chapter 9 and see the divisions within Christianity. listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice, and we continue our beautiful journey looking at the history of the church as we review and serialize the book, A History of the Catholic Church. Now, let's see the division of Christianity. Now, what were the causes of the Reformation? Because actually, when you're talking about this division of Christianity, is when now we start talking about the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. Now, what we have just seen before the break is that there was a great split of Western Christianity in the 16th century. We saw the causes of the split, but now we see this in the 16th century, about 15 something. And the causes for this, actually, according to our authors here, Fathers Norbert and Umberto, is that they say the causes fall under two headings. One is immorality in the church, and also the second one is external changes in society. And the internal problems included clerical corruption, popular superstition, disunity in the church, the lamentable condition of the clergy, and abuses in fundraising. Corruption such as question of favoring relatives was common, as was paying bribes for church appointments. And this is what is called the sin of simony. You know, if I want to be a bishop, I bribe and I get it. It's something that sometimes we see it even in our society today. Powerful or wealthy abbeys often lost the right to elect their abbots because the princess demanded political control of influential offices. There was also political patronage was the norm for such appointments, and religious life deteriorated. And in many cases, also bishops collected the revenues of their dioceses while living very lavish lives. Here the authors narrate that there was an archbishop called Hermann von Wade of Cologne, for example, celebrated Mass only 3 times in his life. When the Reformed bishop St. Charles Borromeo took charge of his diocese of Milan in Italy, crowds came out to watch his arrival because they had not seen a bishop. The crowds came to see his arrival because they had not seen a bishop in 60 years. Bishops and even a few popes lived scandalous lives with mistresses and appointed their illegitimate children to high posts. Because these abuses were part of the daily operation of the church, they were most difficult to remove, and it was especially perplexing for honest people to avoid corruption themselves. So this is one of the reasons that we have the division in the church. Of course, another thing was what we call popular superstition undermined true piety among many. The reverence due to relics degenerated into a market where dishonest men produced fake relics to sell to the innocent faithful, and people believed in exaggerated visions and false miracles. I don't know, it sounds as if this is being written about today. And the Abbey of Conques in France, for example, wanted a magic statue in order to attract pilgrims, so it arranged to have a monk join another monastery in order to kidnap one. Miracle stories were made to enhance the statue's value. Unfortunately, proper religious education of the people was not properly and well done. It was done in a haphazard way. And another problem was that the church itself was not united. That experience of the great schism between the Western and the Eastern church had not healed, and there was conflict between many northern bishops and the Pope. And they resented the papal taxes and all that. Then, of course, the clergy themselves were often poor leaders of the people. Most were trained by neighboring priests who took them in as houseboys and paid them with a little instruction in Latin and theology. After some time, the bishop would give a short examination and ordain them. And it was not an issue to find peasant priests who were almost illiterate and had to memorize the Mass. Most did not preach, so the people rarely heard a sermon. Perhaps when a wandering friar spoke in their village, that's when they could hear something. And village priests were appointed by the local lord, or what we call the manor, and given a small plot of land for growing food, already what we saw in the feudal system. So there was that decline in the church in many areas. And of course, the immediate cause for the Reformation, what now created a reaction in Martin Luther and others who are with him, was actually the abuse of fundraising. Now, besides the taxes imposed by the Pope and bishops, special campaigns were conducted, and people were told that since contributing to the needs of the church was a good deed, they would receive an indulgence for their acts of charity. And church teachings had always held that after the sacramental forgiveness of sins, the Christian had to be cleansed of the after effects of sinfulness by good deeds. And to help the people understand this, special indulgence prayers and acts were listed in official books. These pilgrimages were often taken for the sake of indulgences because the church also believed that one could pray on behalf of the dead, and many offered special suffrages for their ancestors. And of course, there was donation to the poor and all that. And it is at this time that we meet Martin Luther, who writes some of his objections about what was happening. Of course, he also went overboard in his own way. But even in this situation, there was also this demand that the Bible had been kept from the people. But don't forget, the priests were quite illiterate, and many of them could hardly read the Bible. And also at this time, in spite of all this drama that was happening, there were also signs of sanctity also. For example, the famous book, The Imitation of Christ, was one of the most popular spiritual books of all times and was written right before the Reformation. And it brought together in simple form the teaching of a school of spiritual renewal and emphasized interior life. Besides this, religious life produced such holy men as Saint Benedict of Siena, Saint John Capistrano. Mention has already been made of writers, of intellectuals like Saint Thomas More, Saint Cardinal Ximenes de Sinceros. Still, there were people who were trying to bring things right, but probably their voice was not loud enough to make a great difference within the church. So as a result, there was this rise, especially in the German and Austrian areas of Europe, and that is when we meet Martin Luther, who was born in 1483 and died in 1546, and he ignited the flame which became known famously as the Protestant Reformation. And Luther was the son of a prosperous German businessman who had come up from poverty, and Luther was raised in what we call a puritanical manner, often beaten till the blood ran out of his body, as he himself recalled, and his father sent him to the university to study law. And Luther's conversion had two phases. The first was marked by a series of incidents at the age of 20, when he fell ill from his studies and in a fever got twisted up in his sword, nearly killing himself. Shortly after, a close friend was killed in a duel, leaving Luther depressed, and in his melancholy mood, he was caught in a threatening thunderstorm. And when a bolt of lightning knocked him to the ground, he crawled on his knees, terrified, and vowed to Saint Anne that if he were saved, he would become a monk. So, in this way, Luther became an Augustinian friar, even though his father objected seriously. And although the German Augustinians were never lax, they also had some slips in their entrance requirements. And Luther's novitiate lasted only a few months, and in less than 2 years in entering the Augustinian monastery or friary, he was ordained, even though he had hardly begun studying theology. And terrified that he might make a mistake, he was unable to offer his first mass for over a month, and then had to be convinced to stay on the altar to finish it. And Luther was assigned to study scripture and received a doctorate at Wittenberg University at the age of 29, and actually became a professor there. And for him, he found religious life a constant trial, and he feared God, but he could not trust his mercy. And also he had a problem with scrupulosity. So he was forever confessing his sins because he felt that maybe he was not yet forgiven. And following the rule of his order, he was trying to live this life, and it was so tough for him, and near despair, he took up the scriptures and read Romans chapter 1 verse 17, where it's written, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, as it is written, the man shall live by faith." And with these words, a tremendous burden was lifted from Luther's soul, and he felt that he had become liberated. He realized he can only be saved by God's grace and mercy and not his own efforts. And he felt that his fasting, vigils, working at holiness had gained him nothing, but God would give him everything. And this revelation gave Luther a new life, new energy to his teaching. He entered into a period of scholarly work, lecturing, and the event that triggered the Reformation came with the preaching of an indulgence for contributions to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So in case you still have not gotten this book, A History of the Catholic Church, I still encourage you to visit any of the Catholic bookshops or Pauline book centers, book and media centers, or you can also be able to buy this book online by visiting www.paulinesafrica.org. And of course, I still continue to encourage you, besides reading this book that we are reviewing, to continue growing your reading culture, to be able to encourage others to read, that we might all grow in our faith and also have that knowledge that we need that can help us in navigating the different experiences that we have in our lives. And at this time, I want to thank Mr. Timothy Morethi, who is our technician here and who has recorded this program, The Power of Reading, here at Pauline's Studio, Westlands, Nairobi, for Radio Maria Nairobi. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for enduring this long journey that we are making with this history of the church, which I believe is blessing each one of us in a special way. Let us continue praying for the church. Let us also continue learning about our faith and the history of our church. I have been your presenter and host, Sister Beatrice, and until next week, may God bless you and bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.